I now call up H.R. 3202. Committee will come to order. The ASSAD regime Anti-Normalization Act of 2023 bill was circulated in advance. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3202, to prohibit any official action to recognize or normalize relations with any government of Syria that is led by Bashar al-Assad.
Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman is recognized.
Is it in order to consider a bill that hasn't been noticed for at a hearing? Is it in order to consider a bill for markup that's never been noticed for a hearing, that was only introduced last week, that isn't even available on congress.gov as of this hearing? Is that in order?
Did we notice the bill?
We noticed Mr. Wilson's bill, which was introduced
When?
last week.
No.
Mr. Wilson had a hearing on Syria. And the subcommittee held a hearing on Syria.
Subcommittee had a hearing on this issue, and the bill was noticed previously.
The bill was only introduced last week, and the text isn't even available on congress.gov.
We circulated the text in advance, and it's on our...
Text has been circulated in advance, and it's on our website.
And we've complied with all...
But your point's well taken.
I move that the bill be withdrawn in accordance with the rules because it doesn't conform to the rules. The chairman has asked that Republican members not offer amendments to Republican bills, and when Republican bills aren't even available to be noticed for hearings, we can't even have a discussion about the bill.
The subcommittee had...
And then we're
Subcommittee had a hearing on this.
they couldn't have had a hearing on the bill because the bill just got dropped.
There was a hearing on the subject.
There was a hearing on the subject matter. The bill was introduced and has been noticed. Chair recognizes Mr. Wilson.
I asked the chairman to make a ruling as to whether the bill is considered in order.
I rule that it is in order and complies with committee rules. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mike McCall and Ranking Member Greg Meeks. I'm grateful to support several of these bipartisan measures before us today, and I'm particularly grateful for the inclusion of the bipartisan ASSAD regime Anti-Normalization Act of 2023, which is H.R. 3202. For 12 years, the ASSAD regime has been backed by war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran, and has committed unthinkable atrocities of using chemical weapons against the Syrian people. Following pro-democratic and peaceful protest, Assad's forces have engaged in mass torture and murder of civilians, including children. Over 500,000 people have been brutally murdered by this regime and counting. Sadly, incredibly, over half of the population of Syria, 14 million people, have been displaced or have fled as refugees to Turkey, to Egypt, and to Jordan. And it's really inspiring that these countries of Turkey and Egypt and Jordan have welcomed millions of refugees into their country to protect them from the Assad regime. We should always recognize how courageous they are to provide for the people of Syria. As chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia Subcommittee, I held a hearing with the man known as Gravedigger as a witness so that he could be unidentified. He testified about his experience of going from a local civil servant to being forced to dispose of hundreds of bodies in mass graves daily, including a young woman who clearly had been tortured, her infant child clinging to her lifeless body. Recently, with the readmission of Bashar al-Assad into the Arab League, we have witnessed, sadly, signals of normalization with war criminal Putin and Assad. We cherish our relationship with our allies against the deadly narcotic drug that is being provided of Captagon pouring into their countries. However, the normalization with an unrepentant dictator and kleptocrat who continues bombing the earthquake-devastated areas of Syria does not represent a viable path forward. Additionally, Bashar al-Assad has a symbiotic network of support from the regime in Tehran, and war criminal Putin to continue supporting terrorism in the region in Putin's war in Ukraine, against Ukraine. This bill significantly strengthens existing sanctions on those who support Assad and imposes real penalties for those considering normalizing with this brutal regime. This bill's inclusion in today's markup represents the tireless efforts of the Syrian American community. I have had the opportunity to meet with the courageous Syrian Americans who have suffered tremendously under this regime. Their entire communities and livelihoods destroyed. They feel that they've been forgotten, but our message is clear. It's bipartisan that they are not forgotten. We're particularly appreciative of the patriotic Syrian Americans who are with us in the audience today, representing a number of organizations of the American Coalition for Syria. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. French is recognized. French Hill.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to say that I'm an original co-sponsor of the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act. I want to thank my friend and the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, Joe Wilson, for his hearing that he had recently where he took eyewitness testimony as to the atrocities conducted by Bashar al-Assad and his gang in Damascus. I want to appreciate his steady hand at overseeing what's happened in the past 12 years in Syria and communicating to the American people what has been the result of Assad's brutal promise to his own citizens in 2011, 2012, when he said, Assad or burn the country. And he has certainly burned the country and will, I hope, pay the price through the UN mechanism for war crimes, for what's taken there. And I hope that the American people understand that his co-conspirators include Iran and Russia in propping up this regime, and that in no way should the Arab nations seek to normalize relations with Assad. It's a huge mistake. It's a diplomatic mistake. And they clearly never learned President Reagan's admonition of trust but verify, because they have invited Assad to the Arab League meeting and now to the next COP meeting with no preconditions, Mr. Chairman. There are no preconditions. And so this mass murderer who has disrupted the entire Middle East region, put Lebanon at risk, been a partner with Iran, the arch enemy of the Gulf states, is paying no price and is committed to no concrete change as to the conduct of his operation. Then, to put salt in the wound, Mr. Chairman, Assad, his relatives, the army, are poisoning the Gulf by exporting Captagon drug, billions of dollars worth, across the Gulf and to Europe. So in addition to being a mass murderer, he is a drug kingpin. And this Congress has recognized that by the Caesar sanctions legislation and by attaching to the NDAA last December my Captagon Act, directing the Secretary of State to craft a strategy to interdict and end Captagon and cut off the funding to the Assad regime. And yet last week, I was in Jordan, in Amman, and in Jerusalem and in Cairo at the time this news was breaking, watching the reactions of our friends in the community relate to it, and in disbelief, really. In disbelief that there was just a vesting of the Assad regime back into the Arab League and pay no price. No end to Captagon, no end to taking Iranian money, no end to backing Iranian militias, no end to attacking Israel, no end to partnering with Hezbollah. And it's stunning to me that the Arabs, or I should say the Arab League member countries, have considered that the reason for re-engagement is on Captagon, this exporting of poisoning. So I want to say I was grateful to the United Kingdom and the United States for imposing Caesar sanctions for the first time on March 28th. Secretary Blinken testified in this committee on the record that he had asked the Arab League nations not to recognize Assad. And that's in direct contrast with the actions of his State Department, where his Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf, Assistant Secretary of the Near East, was out there tearing the world. Well, if you negotiate with Assad, make sure you get something for it. Well, guess what? They've negotiated with him, giving him credibility, and they got nothing for it. Nothing. So it's sickening that we're essentially abandoning the rest of Syria to Assad's torture and murder, and that's why this bill is so important. That's why I support my friend Mr. Wilson for his efforts, and I hope that as this bill is marked up and moves to the House floor, we can remind our friends in the diplomatic community that the Congress consistently over the last decade stands with the people of Syria. The millions of people outside Syria that want to go home to their villages, that want to have a representational government, they want to get their lives back, to remove the refugees from Jordan, the refugees from Lebanon, from Turkey. And I don't think these recent actions taken by the Arab League are remotely in the interest of the Syrian people, nor do I think they'll cut off Captagon. I'm counting on leadership from the United States and our partners in the region to do that. I thank my friend from South Carolina, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't help but note, as we sit here today, that it has been over 12 years since the Syrian people first rose up for their basic rights and then endured brutal assaults by Assad's Russian and Iranian-backed military year after year. The Assad regime has unceasingly perpetuated its campaign of violence against the Syrian people, committing what is amounted to countless of war crimes and the most egregious violations of international humanitarian law. As we consider these measures today, the war has resulted to over 600,000 Syrians killed and more than 8 million displaced. Hospitals, schools, and neighborhoods are still regularly targeted as hundreds of thousands of Syrians face bleak prospects for their future. It is in this context we consider this bill, which responds to moves by some governments to look past these crimes and heinous atrocities and readmit the Assad regime into the international institutions. The Biden administration has opposed efforts to re-engage with the Assad regime with commercial deals and economic benefits. I stand with the administration and those who believe Assad must be held accountable, which is why I partnered with you, Mr. Chairman, earlier this month and publicly condemned efforts by some states to welcome Assad back into the Arab League. As we condemn such actions, I continue to stand with the Syrian people resisting Assad's oppression, its torture apparatus. Simultaneously, I support the Biden administration's efforts to provide the Syrian people with humanitarian assistance as they recover from multiple devastating earthquakes, while also withstanding continued assaults from Assad's air force. It is in that spirit I will support this bill for the purposes of this markup. The legislation will discourage other states from overlooking Assad's crimes against humanity and makes it United States policy not to recognize an Assad-led Syrian government. Importantly, this bill also expands targeted sanction authorities against the Assad regime's efforts to exploit existing sanctions while preserving important humanitarian exemptions and provisions. However, I'm still concerned about the second-order consequences of certain sanctions on legitimate humanitarian assistance efforts and look forward to ensuring sound implementation so that those most in need of aid can receive it. Finally, this bill also requires greater scrutiny on and policy attention towards the mechanisms by which the Assad regime launders and manipulates international aid for its own ends at the expense of the Syrian people. So again, I appreciate my friend from South Carolina, Representative Wilson, and Chairman McCall's work on this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Davidson's recognized.
I move to strike the last word. I thank the chairman. I think, frankly, our colleagues who are working on an important subject, I find it, I think as everyone could tell, very frustrating to be moving bill text that, frankly, we've got a situation with the rules of the committee that makes this acceptable on this committee, apparently. Maybe on others, but I've had the good fortune to be involved in a committee for 6 years now that does things differently. They start on time, they end on time, they hold people to 5 minutes when they're recognized for 5 minutes. And when they want to move a bill, the standard is that they notice it at a hearing, not the subject, but the bill text itself. And that's important so that we can have, friendly amendments. Frankly, the chairman considers any amendment not friendly if it's not done behind closed doors outside the hearing. And so, in an effort to defer to the chairman's practice, if not rules, I've offered no amendment to this bill. I will simply vote no. And until we vote no on things that are done with bad process, I think we'll continue to have less than adequate legislation, and we will continue to have either a system where the committee is dominated by people willing to completely be submissive and do whatever they're told, or people who simply say, this is a joke. You can't even have input and collaboration on the committee. Why would you want to be on the committee? And I think that's the challenge we confront. I hope that we convene as a group and come up with a better way to work together. Because there are important subjects that we can do, and many of them are truly bipartisan, and there's a chance to build consensus. But when you can't have the notice, even if you can offer an amendment, it's not like complete ignorance of this process that drives this system. It literally is power, because the bill is designed to have no amendments, is designed to have no collaboration, because time is what's necessary to socialize the amendment. So you could offer it, but you don't have time to win over your colleagues and convince them of why the amendment would be important or necessary. You don't have hearings to discuss it wherein you might raise points of order. And you don't even have time, in the absence of the bill being noticed, before it goes to markup, to socialize the things that you were supposed to have learned at the hearing. So the subject is incredibly important. The bill has a lot of things that I would be inclined to support, but several that I'd like to amend. And we just saw earlier today how things are received when you offer an amendment. And as I say, just offering it is one thing, but the ability to pass it is another, and you can't do that without time. So I hope we'll consider how we run the show. In the absence of that, I'll be voting no. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Phillips is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks and Mr. Wilson for bringing this measure before all of us today. Just last month, under Chair Wilson's leadership, the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia held a hearing marking 12 years of unimaginable suffering, displacement, and conflict since the Syrian revolution began. Under the brutal leadership of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian regime has ushered in over a decade of violence and human rights abuses, but has not faced an iota of accountability for its murder of over 500,000 people, or its torture and displacement of tens of thousands more. Instead, Assad has continued his assault on Syrian civilians, all while enriching himself, including by diverting humanitarian aid and trafficking in narcotics. And instead of being punished, was recently rewarded for this heinous behavior by being readmitted into the Arab League. This terrible misstep demonstrates why the U.S. leadership is so important now more than ever. And I'm grateful that this committee has now come together in a bipartisan fashion to send a strong message that the United States will not recognize nor normalize with the government of Syria while Assad is in power, and will actively oppose any attempts by other governments to do so. This amendment strengthens the underlying legislation by ensuring the expanded Caesar sanctions authorities more effectively target nefarious actors within and supporting the regime, and that legitimate humanitarian actors are not inadvertently impacted at the expense of desperately needed delivery of humanitarian assistance. And while I remain concerned about provisions of the bill that take aim at regional energy independence, of which the current system only benefits Iran and its proxies, I'm eager to continue working together on this legislation and creating clear, bipartisan Syria strategies that are realistic, based on United States national security priorities and rooted in a commitment to the Syrian people. I want to close by thanking my dear friend and colleague, Chair Wilson, for authoring this amendment and for his willingness to work with all of us on this issue in a bipartisan fashion. With that, I urge my colleagues to support the measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment number 1 at the desk.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3202, offered by Mr. Wilson of South Carolina. In Section 2A1.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to support this bipartisan amendment with Ranking Member Greg Meeks. This would further clarify a number of points in the underlying bill, including preserving the protections for humanitarian, non-governmental organizations, and strengthens the bill by including determination on Bashar al-Assad's wife, Asma al-Assad's corrupted charity, which is directly involved in diverting assistance meant for the very deserving people of Syria. It also extends the bipartisan Syrian Civilian Protection Act until 2032. The latest text also prevents evasion of the original bill's $50,000 reporting requirement for donations to Assad by making it a $500,000 total per source per year. This assures that the corrupt sources that give to Assad through transaction just under the threshold are still accountable. I truly appreciate the bipartisan spirit by which this agreement has been reached, and I'm grateful for the Ranking Member Greg Meeks' input to strengthen the bill, and I appreciate so much the very significant work of the Ranking Member Dean Phillips, who on April the 18th at the hearing, it was very much discussed. Assad, the bill was discussed, the text was discussed, it was circulated, and indeed in accordance with our rules. The bill that remains strong is based on this bipartisan bill and agreement as it reaches the floor, and it's important that we maintain such a strong bill to send a message of hope to the people of Syria. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that I support this amendment, and I want to thank the gentleman from South Carolina and you, Mr. Chairman, for working with this amendment with me. Again, it's a full bipartisan piece, and I appreciate working together. I believe that this makes the bill even stronger, and I continue to look forward as we look at what's going on around the world and try to make sure that we do things in a bipartisan way. So just thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Wilson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, I now move that the committee report H.R. 3202 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming